Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and work out the free response question that we were doing together in class in this YouTube video for your easy access. So I may toggle back and forth between using my little notepad thingy majiggy, whatever this is, and typing, just as it becomes easier for me. And so the first thing I wanted to say is that this question is, I need to modify it a bit. So the following table represents the number of labor hours it will take the United States and China to produce either 1 unit of steel or 1 electric vehicle. And so this is an input type question. It's really important for us to approach finding the comparative advantage to recognize that input and output questions require different approaches to finding comparative advantage. So I'm going to show you both approaches in this video that you can certainly use to help you find the comparative advantage. Okay, so first we can go ahead, and the first way we can determine, let's see, what color should I use? No. So we can convert this input table into an output table. Convert to an output table. And so I'm going to make a rough one right here: steel, electric vehicles, USA, and China. And the way that we can convert it into an output table is by randomly assigning a number of hours per day. We can say, 8-hour workdays are pretty conventional, right? And so we can convert this into an output table, and we can ask ourselves, how many units of steel can the United States produce in an 8-hour workday? So we take 8 hours, divide by 6, and we find out that the United States can produce 4/3 units of steel, or 1 1/4 units of steel, or 1 1/3 units of steel. Do the same for China. How many units of steel can they produce in an 8-hour workday? We know it should be the same. 4/3 electric cars, and then 8 divided by 2 for steel units. Okay, so this is the first approach. We converted the input table into an output table, but now we want to convert this input table into or this output table into a table demonstrating comparative advantage. Hold on. So which country has the absolute advantage in the production of steel? We can think about this from, using the input data, but we can also just use this table to help us solve this, solve absolute advantage. So in the production of steel, So we see that the United States in an 8-hour workday can produce 4/3 units of steel, and China in an 8-hour workday can produce 8 units of steel. So China has the absolute advantage in the production of steel, and then it asks you to explain, right? Which country, or actually it doesn't ask you to explain, but if it were to ask you to explain, you might want to give your rationale behind it. So you could either say China has the absolute advantage in the production of steel because it takes them 1 hour to produce 1 unit of steel, while it takes the United States 1 hour to produce 6 units, or 6 hours to produce 1 unit of steel. Or you can reference this output table and say because has the advantage in the production of steel because in an 8-hour workday, China can, and remember this 8-hour workday is like arbitrarily decided. You can easily say 10-hour workday or 6-hour workday, whatever. But China has the absolute advantage in the production of steel because in an 8-hour workday, China can produce 8 units of steel, while the United States can only produce 4/3 unit of steel, or a little bit over 1 unit of steel. Like, you can get a little vague if you want. Then likewise, which country has the absolute advantage in the production of electric vehicles? Again, it takes China less time to produce electric vehicles, so clearly China has the absolute advantage in the production of electric vehicles, right? Now, on to the more difficult part. Which country has the comparative advantage in the production of steel? Let me delete this. So given this output table, we want to find, we can say the opportunity cost of the United States and then because we want to be able to compare this, we want to find the per unit opportunity cost of producing steel. So we want to get this value to 1. The way we can do this is multiply by 4/3 by the reciprocal. So times 3/4 times 3/4 to get 1. And we find the per unit opportunity cost of the United States producing 1 unit of steel is 1 unit of electric cars. So per unit opportunity cost. So the United States, for every time it chooses to produce 1 unit of steel, it gives up 1 unit of electric cars. Pretty simple. Now we have to find the opportunity cost of China, producing. We take the output table. Eight steel units. So what does China give up by producing 8 steel units? They give up 4. This shouldn't be steel units. This should be electric cars. They give up 4 electric cars. Divide by 8, because again, we want to find the per unit opportunity cost of China producing steel, and we find that for each unit of steel, China gives up half a car. And then we said that the country with the lowest opportunity cost in the per unit production of a good should produce that good, or they have the comparative advantage in that good and therefore should specialize and produce that good. It's clear that 1/2 is lower than 1, and so therefore China has the comparative advantage in the production of steel. So despite China having the comparative advantage of the production of steel, and the production, or I'm sorry, the absolute advantage of the production of steel and the absolute advantage in the production of electric vehicles, this idea and principle of comparative advantage says that China should specialize in the production of steel. I told you that if it's clear that one country, person, or firm has a comparative advantage in the production of something, I can redo this example and show you that the United States has the comparative advantage in the production of electric vehicles because they have a lower per unit opportunity cost in producing an electric vehicle than China does, or you can just say that, right? When it says, how do you know this? You definitely want to, explain how you know this. China has the comparative advantage in the production of steel because they have the lowest per unit opportunity cost of producing steel. The United States has the comparative advantage in the production of electric vehicles. Your rationale for that could be because China has the comparative advantage in the production of steel, or you can be more specific and say because the United States has a lower per unit opportunity cost of producing electric vehicles. Cool. And then which country should produce steel and which should produce electric vehicles? It's clear that the principle of comparative advantage says that the US should produce electric vehicles, China should produce steel. Okay, cool. So before I show you a different approach, I want to look at this output table, right? So we have 4/3 unit of steel. That's the max amount of steel that they can produce. 4/3 unit of electric cards, 8 steel units, and then 4 electric cards right here. And so one thing that you can do if you're just given this output data, so let's ignore this for a second. If you're just given this output data, one way that you can think about finding the per unit comparative advantage of a good, you don't have to write out this little opportunity cost of the US producing 4/3 of steel and then, then think through that sort of logic. You can do a kind of shortcut, but I just wanted you to understand the logic. And that shortcut is illustrated by this acronym. Output is it output? Yeah, see, this is what I messed up in class. Output other over. And so what this means is that you're going to take this bit of output, right? Because pretending we're just having the output data, or, you could have converted the input to the output data and you can do this. And then to find the opportunity cost or let's note it a different way. US opportunity cost for steel production, the per unit opportunity cost, we can put the other value, so the 4/3, 4/3 And in the denominator, put the value of the good whose opportunity costs, whose per unit opportunity cost you're trying to determine. And then what you should get, 4/3 divided by 4/3 is just 1. And it will give you the US opportunity cost of steel becomes 1 electric car. Specifically, the US opportunity cost for 1 unit of steel, right? So this is a shortcut, a mental shortcut to finding the per unit opportunity cost of a particular good. Okay, pretty cool. So it's, let me highlight it right here. If you're given output data, use this acronym, output data, put the other value, or you can think of it as putting on the top of the fraction what you give up, so 4/3, and in the denominator, you put the maximum output value of the good and good whose opportunity per unit opportunity cost you're trying to determine. It'll give you, you divide it out, you should find the opportunity cost of producing 1 good of steel in terms of an electric car. Let's look at it with the other example. We have, again, we can do output other over. So our output for China. So let's say we want to find the Chinese opportunity cost of producing 1 steel unit, right? 1 steel unit. Then we put the other value, so what you give up. So 4 electric cars over the max value, assuming you allocate all productive resources to producing steel, of the good whose opportunity per unit opportunity cost you're trying to determine. 4 divided by 8 should give you 1/2. And so you find out that the opportunity cost, the Chinese opportunity cost per unit opportunity cost of producing, or the per unit opportunity cost of steel, or the Chinese opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of steel is 1/2 a unit of electric cars. So nice little trick, right? Which brings us to the next little acronym that can help us more quickly find the opportunity cost and then the comparative advantage of goods and services. So specifically, we can use this acronym, input. So when you're given input data, other under, meaning put it in the denominator. And so this allows us to use this input data. We don't have to convert this input data to determine the opportunity cost of the per unit opportunity cost of a good. So for example, if we want to find the, let's go with China because these whole numbers. Chinese opportunity cost, per unit opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of steel equals output, or I'm sorry, not output, other under, so we're going to put what we give up specifically, we're going to put the maximum or the labor hours it takes to produce a single good of, or a single electric car. We're going to put that in the denominator. We're going to put that in the denominator. So other under. So we're going to put in the numerator 1 hour. In the denominator 2 hours. So we find the per unit opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of steel is, as we previously identified, right, with the output data, to be half a unit of electric vehicles. This is a much faster approach, right? And you can, we spelled out the logic a little bit. And if you need the logic spelled out because you're one of those nerds, certainly we can, and we do a lot of logic spelling out, but sometimes it really just helps to memorize these sort of mental tricks. I certainly, the mental trick that I remembered when I was taking, principles of economics in college, I remembered that for output data to find the per unit opportunity cost of a good, I would always put in the numerator what you give up, and then in the denominator what you are producing. Yeah, so these little mental tricks help. That way we don't have to understand necessarily. Memorizing this can certainly help us complete these a lot faster. But if you like the idea of converting the input data to output data and then converting that to finding the per unit opportunity costs of each good per country, that's also acceptable. So we find the Chinese opportunity cost of 1 unit of steel is half an electric vehicles. I can do this again to find the American opportunity cost of 1 unit of steel, and then I'm going to go ahead and answer the rest of the questions. American OC of 1 steel. And remember, for input data, other under. For this one, it really doesn't matter, right? And then we come at 1 electric. Or I'm just going to put car, and it's easier just to put car. 1 half cars. 1 car. The American opportunity cost of 1 unit of steel is 1 car. Chinese opportunity cost of 1 unit of steel is half a car. Simple, right? And now we're aware that since the principle of comparative advantage says that the country that gives up less, or the person or the firm that gives up less, which is China, in the per unit production of a good, should produce that good, according to this Ricardian model of trade. So China will produce steel because what they give up is a lot smaller than what the United States gives up. And the United States should specialize in the production of cars. Okay, cool. All right, so I already answered those econ questions. I showed you the different approaches. Okay, so now we're going to go into the government questions. The Trump administration has decided to impose tariffs, taxes on imported goods on Chinese steel. Why might economists oppose this policy? So you can think of it many different ways. So economists might oppose this policy because it doesn't allow the United States to specialize in a good or service in which it has a comparative advantage. Right, because essentially the tariffs are designed to, this was actually happening in the Trump administration, right? You can read this policy report at the Brookings Institution where it talks about like the effects and the magnitude of these tariffs on the economy. And we'll talk more about, you know, how governmental interventions, we'll talk about tariffs and subsidies in Unit 4 can, you know, lead to an inefficient allocation of resources or, you know, affect social welfare later. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of this, but economists might oppose this policy because it doesn't allow the United States to specialize in a good or service in which it has the comparative advantage. And if the United States imposes tariffs, you can like look at the U.S. angle. It will buoy a steel industry that and divert valuable resources to steel that should be going to the production of electric cars. And we had talked about the gains from trade, and we're going to talk more about this next week. But the idea is that if China produces, you know, steel, and the United States produces electric vehicles. I don't know why I circled that. But the logic is pretty... Why am I circling that? I don't know. So if China produces steel, right, they can produce, let's say in an 8-hour workday, they can produce 8 units of steel. We can draw actually the production possibilities frontiers, and we can show that when China and the United States produce, you know, what they're good at, we end up with a greater abundance of, or greater production of these types of goods and services. And also we realize that, or what we end up is in a scenario in which China is able to, how can I put this? Or electric cars. Yeah, in the United States is producing, and I'm doing the output. Let me do the math really quickly. It's 4, 8 divided by 6, 4/3, 4/3. We'll map out the grains of trade for next week. I'm going to hold for a moment because this complicates things pedagogically. Yes, this complicates things because I don't want to graph a fraction. Okay, anyways, so essentially what specialization allows is like China would be able to, in an environment where China would be able to acquire cars, right? If the United States specialized in it, and they would be able to trade steel, but they would be able to acquire cars. Let's say China gave up 1 unit of steel. We can map out the PPFs, and we would be able to see that if China gave up 1 unit of steel, they can acquire it from the United States at a lower opportunity cost than 1/2. And this is significant because for China, if China alone was not producing a good or service, they would, if China alone was producing both goods and services, to get a car, they would need to give up 2 units of steel, right? Because this is what that half means. But since China and the United States are both producing a good or service, to get a car, no longer does China need to produce exactly 2 units of steel to acquire 1 car, because specialization allows for gains in trade in terms of that, and greater and more efficient allocation of resources and production of resources. We're going to map this out later. Yeah, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it next week. Or let's do it now. Let's see if I can. So let's see that 1. No, we'll do it next week. Okay. Does that allow the United States to position really good at service in which has a comparative advantage? If the United States imposes tariffs, it will buoy a steel industry and divert valuable resources to steel that should be going to the production of electric cars. Explain how the legislative branch might interact with the executive branch decision in question number 5, assuming a specified number of members in both parties disagree with the action in question number 5. And remember, we said that there are different types of questions. These starred questions are examples of AP government questions. So we're going to start to try to, or I'm going to try to make an effort to review AP government concepts as we teach microeconomics. And we said description is kind of a listing of the characteristics of something, and an explanation really relates one thing to something else, for clarification. There are different ways that you can explain a phenomenon. You can talk about, the causes and relate them to the effects of a phenomenon. You can talk about, sort of the relationships between 2 types of variables. Explanation really requires more than description. Description requires more than identification, right? So explain how this is kind of something that you can expect to see on a concept application question in your AP government test. Explain how the legislative branch might interact with the executive branch decision in question number 5, assuming an unspecified number of members in both parties disagree with the action in question number 5. Right? So you could put the legislative branch could do many things. The legislative branch could pass a law that alters the United States to not increase tariffs on Chinese steel if enough members in the legislative branch disagreed with executive branch policies. You can also say the legislative branch could subpoena the trade advisors, Trump administration trade advisors, subpoena / ask Trump administration trade advisors to appear before Congress to explain the political and economic decision-making or rationale behind pursuing tariffs on China. You can also imagine that if the legislative branch decides to hold hearings, they could you can also imagine a world in which the legislative branch decided to hold hearings and they invited, economists to testify, right? And so it says unspecified number of people in both parties disagree. So we could say, expound upon the idea a little bit more in order to determine whether further congressional action is needed to change U.S. policymaking. Then number 7, explain how either economic ideology, protectionism, Keynesianism, laissez-faire, or partisanship would influence how Democrats and Republicans determine whether to check the executive branch. You can talk about so many different things. So we talked about laissez-faire economic ideology, this kind of handoff approach to the economy. And we said that conventionally, really before Trump, that was kind of like the go-to policy for Republicans, this handoff approach to managing economic affairs, this, veneration of free markets and stuff like that. And then we watched this little Economist video today, which talked about how President Trump really, liked to or embraced a lot of, especially with respect to trade policy, a lot of protectionist policies. Keynesianism really doesn't fit so much here, but we can also just talk in general about how the left, the far left elements in the Democratic Party are more, have a lot of ideological overlap in terms of trade policy with President Trump than I think a lot of people, supporters of President Trump or supporters of maybe somebody like AOC or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who has a kind of far left vision and protectionist vision of trade policy, would give them credit for. But you can talk about so many different elements. You can also talk about partisanship. Maybe Republicans who, despite adopting a laissez-faire approach to managing the economy or believing in this laissez-faire economic ideology, are just going to give Trump a pass because he's a Republican. Or you can imagine Democrats, and especially the ones, that have historically, the left parties and all societies historically have been attached with funds and support from organized labor. You can talk about how a bunch of left Democrats are now trying to rediscover free market are now more embracing of a kind of laissez-faire ideology with respect to trade policy because of partisanship, and they want to, deal President Trump a blow. You can talk about any of those certain elements in the answer to question 7. Okay. Okay, cool. Bye.